transparency, accountability, and sustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. We are the champion. We are the champion. We are the
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this afternoon is not going to be a prayer session where a lot of people will be busy interceding while I'm busy presenting here, especially after eating our staple food. Okay, so good afternoon to you all. No, it's very difficult to present after the doctors, the professionals have commented about the same issue that you are going to present. So what I'm going to do is, I won't bother you with some of the issues that have been raised in the previous presentation, especially by Doctor. Doctor was, the report is so powerful. Okay, maybe you can proceed to the, okay, so this is the structure of my presentation, but I'll begin with the introduction, the literature review, conceptual framework, and the methodology, but I won't go much on that. What we want to know more is about the overview of the pre-COVID situation in terms of the debt in the public finance management and social service delivery, and also to see how it has impacted debt, PFM, and SSD. So you find that some of the issues have been discussed, so I'll try to look at some of the areas that were not discussed by the previous presenters. Next. Okay, so on this one, I think it's now clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the lives of all countries and negatively affect the economic growth. Then there's globally, it is said there was a decrease in economic growth, which ranges from 3.4 to 7.6, and it is expected to recover in this year. Then there's, but one thing that we can agree from the presentation is that Zimbabwe is in debt crisis, debt distress, the debt is unsustainable, and we saw that in 2020 there was a contraction in terms of economic growth. We are saying generally the economy did not perform well. It actually, it was a negative growth. So, but as you can see, you cannot talk about debt issues as an isolated thing. It's something that cut across. One of the challenges that we are facing is to convince people that they are affected by debt in their day-to-day life. That's why I remember someone saying, you guys are bombarding us with figures. The issue is maybe just try for people to understand, but what we need to do now is to try to find the human face to these figures. So we all, okay, if I say we all understand, I may be wrong. Okay, Zimbabwe was in a dire situation in terms of the inflation. We remember it was at one point it was 622%, which had increased from 226 in 2019. But now we are now talking of something which is less than 60%. We are also living in an economy where we are saying those who are in control of the economy, or whom we expect, or I would say the Minister of Finance is saying there is stable, the economy is stable. Yet, if you then look at the ground for those who are in the street to then say, for example, do you use the 86 to say $1 is equals to 86 RTGS? Do you use that rate? You find that most of the people, they will say, we normally don't use this rate. So this is the state that we are saying, those in the formal economy, everything seems to be okay. Whereas in the informal economy is something else. And you define that, do we agree that generally the Zimbabwe is highly informal? So is it then fair to use the figures in the formal sector to determine what is happening in the informal sector? So these are some of the questions that we have to ask. Right now, I think all eyes are on the 961 million that came from IMF. And it's very unfortunate that we knew that the amount of money was going to come. But right now, we are being told that we are preparing again. I don't know. Maybe it's another question of the day. Next slide. So, if I then present this presentation, there are certain things that this picture is saying. I would want to hear maybe some of you. What do you think, and how are these things that are on the picture are related? What are your views? Is there a volunteer based on this picture? Okay, maybe as we may see, I'll bring it toward the end. But basically, what I'm going to present is all said by this picture, where we are saying we are struggling with our debt, and that debt leads to maybe impose or sort of increase the tax burden on citizens. And some say we are sitting on a time bomb. Some are saying we need to audit this debt. And now there's the AFA hashtag. We are saying the educational sector, you can look at this corner, it's a classroom. Then the other side, that is a health hazard on itself. Then at the center is COVID. So right now, everyone is focused on COVID, to the extent that these other sections are losing out just because the focus is on what? On coronavirus. Next slide. Okay, I think I won't bother you about the research objective, but basically what I wanted to find was to see the effect of COVID-19 to public management, public finance management, also issues of what? Social service delivery. But like I said, you cannot talk about debt in itself. Somehow it affects other sectors. So can you move to the next slide? So that was my conceptual framework, where I would say COVID would lead to increase in debt, also reduce the GDP, and like through the growth, and also issues of reducing the revenue that may lead to poor social service delivery. So along the way, we need to find out if this is happening in Zimbabwe. Next slide. So what are some of the key reflections? I enjoyed the conversation that was going on between Dr. Moyo and a certain guy, where we are seeing, generally there are different views when we see these dates. And it's not new. Even in the history, we find that there are different views when it comes to debt. There are the Keynesian views. Then there's also the classical. Of course, there's now neoliberal, neo-colonial, but I just thought of two sectors, where the Keynesians have the view that debt is moral and productive and beneficial, provided that it's productive. So I mean, it leads to employment, it leads to improvement in terms of standards of living. Then the classical view that government borrowing is infinitely wasteful and devastating to prosperity and even morally unjust. So see, we still have those questions within ourselves. If we were to ask ourselves, some of the view that the debt is very bad, some will say the debt is good. But however, like someone said, the debt itself is not bad, right? But what that debt is spent on is the major issue, right? So I looked at 24 studies, and out of those 24 studies, they were different. Some were covering 12 countries, some would cover even up to 118 for the period from 1946 to 2016. All these studies, they all agree that generally at a certain point in time as you continue to borrow, the debts, when the debt to GDP reached a certain point, it will then cause negative effect to the economy, right? So I also looked at other studies. I looked at 7 studies in Zimbabwe. So at this global level where I looked at 24, they all agree that there's a certain threshold. And the threshold for them, it was between 75% to 100. But in Zimbabwe, I realized there were, for the document that I used, there were only 2 people, 2 researchers who worked on the issue of threshold. And one of them is Dr. Elizabeth Mpunga, where he said, in case of Zimbabwe, the threshold is 45 to 50%. Then there's the other one, Saungwema in 2020, who said it's what, 50%. So we can safely, based on this theoretical view, are saying generally it's 45 to 57%. Once we exceed that, debt to GDP ratio, it means debt will have a negative effect to economic growth. We can proceed. So you would also see that there is a general agreement that public finance was negatively affected by COVID-19, issues of fiscal deficits, where we are saying we are spending more than what we are collecting. Then there's issue of where debt repayment imposes a burden on debtor country, decreasing the well-being of citizens. It was also seen that it transferred to future generation. I think that has been discussed. So I want to say, as we go through some of the reflections that we see, we also need to apply it in the Zim context to see, do we see the same in our country? There's also that the debt reduces government capacity to invest in human development, and it reduces the capacity of the state to respond to discharge its constitutional obligations. Next slide. Right? So, in the Zim context, I found out that before COVID, that is the prior COVID situation, Zimbabwe was already in debt distress. Generally, the level of the debt was unsustainable. Whether that debt was odious or not odious, legal or illegal, based on the figures that are out there, it is said there was what? The debt was, Zimbabwe was in a debt distress. And it's on record of not following the constitution in terms of for example, the SADC threshold of 60%, the Public Act threshold of 70%, and even the overdraft, which always far exceed the 20% limit. Then you also find that there was a IMF did a debt sustainability risk rating of Zimbabwe in 2019, and they stressed that Zimbabwe was in debt distress. So I'm just like trying to bring to you what was happening before COVID. Then you also realize we have heard about, I won't bother you by repeating what we've been saying, the issues of what, the inherited debt of 700. I think it sparked some discussions before we go to the line, before we go to our lunch. Then also, you would find that around 1990, we also received some bailouts from World Bank, under the well-known Economic Structural Adjustment Program. And Zimbabwe has been debt distress since year 2000. That's where it started to fail to, or it defaulted on its external obligations. Then also external arrears continually increased from 109, I won't bother you with that. Let's proceed to the next thing. So we also heard about the issues of war vets. I think one way or another, you may be related to war vet. It's another issue that also contributed to our debt. Some call it the Black Friday. That is 14 November 1997. There is also, so just because the government was now under pressure, because it had no access to external funds, it then resorted to to issue treasury bills and bonds. So that also led to increase in the domestic debt. Then you also find that some of the debt was used for fuel, millennium, and subsidy, command agriculture. I think we heard about the debt assumption by RBZ, a sensitive issue again, but we have to discuss it into it so that we understand the legality of the debt. Another issue that we need to note is also issues of parastatals. They are also contributing in terms of the debt that we have. That will end up in the government books through guarantees and resumption. Next slide. So now looking at the public finance management, we would find that Zimbabwe was also struggling in terms of revenue mobilization through issues such as illicit financial flows. I think nowadays that word is being said over and over again. But what we may need is to maybe try to demystify the issues around IFCs. Then also issue of harmful tax incentives. We are not saying tax incentives in general terms they are bad, right? But are they evaluated to see if they can lead to maybe to improve the standards of living of people, or we just issue for the sake of issuing, even if the studies shows that it's one of the least things that companies look at when it comes to issues of what it's as that Africans are just competing themselves in terms of offering say favorable tax incentives, whereas there are other issues like geological, to know what is that you have in your, so what is that under the ground, which is important than issue of what tax incentives. Then ZIMRA, I'll give an example, is the revenue authority that we have in Zimbabwe, has been surpassing its target since 2017. That was prior COVID. But however, I realized that generally the tax to GDP ratio was falling. And this is one of the measures that is used to measure the performance of a tax administration. And the issues of mismanagement of funds is all written in the auditor's reports. So it's not new if we then see those things happen again in the post-COVID era. Then IMF in 2018 also noted that there were some unbudgeted expenditure for politically sensitive programs, which were estimated to be 2.8 billion, which was almost equivalent to 10% of the GDP, or approximately equal to 2018 deficit. So that's another problem that we are facing. And there was no proper step that was taken. But I remember recently I heard there was a discussion that was being done by some of the members of parliament, and the way they were saying they later came up with try to follow the proper steps. But now it was sort of like too late, because they were supposed to do that in 2028. I think the members of parliament were first on that one. Then there's issues of opaque financing, repeated spending in excess of appropriation, overspending. And one of the major challenges that we face in Zimbabwe is not fully complying with the constitutional and legal requirements in respect of PFM, RBZ Act, Debt Management Act, and PFM obligation to table audited consolidated financial statement in parliament. Next. So this is what I'm talking. When you then looked at the tax to GDP ratio, would you find that from 2011 to 2019, the tax to GDP ratio was falling. And at a certain point in time, we were now performing below the African average, or even to say in 2019, there was that issue of 1:1. It really affected. So some of the figures are distorted just because of that policy that came into effect. Next slide. Now, in terms of social service delivery, and this research I was focusing on health and education, but this doesn't mean that that's the only social service delivery that we may need to discuss in this house. So you define that the high debt service that we, or when we pay our debt service, or when we're paying our debt services, we are now sort of like foregoing the money that we're supposed to use maybe to improve the education sector or even the health sector to pay those debts. Even if we say we pay the 1 million, that 1 million would have done something better in terms of provision. But however, there was a question that was raised: should we then not pay our debts? I don't know. The answer will come from you as we discuss. But we are saying the moment we set aside a certain amount to pay our debts, we are foregoing the health and what health and education sector. Then another fascinating issue was to see that at one point in time, for example, in 2019, 72% of the health budget was being funded by donors, and the rest was being maybe funded by taxpayers. But that is not sustainable, and that is not predictable. It then, I think we understand when then begin to do the effect of COVID on these services. Then also, Auditor General reports also spotted the issue of subsidizing loss-making parastatals, where we know that they are not performing very well, but we continue to finance them. Then you wonder, why are we continuing to do this if we know that they are not making, maybe there are good reasons, but we find that he then said if that man was then used to provide health and education, could have done better, or social services in general. Then there's also element now looking not only on health and education. We would find that we can also talk of social safety nets, where we would see that yes, they are there. However, the issue of not having a database to then say, do the actual or the people who are supposed to be helped are being helped. And there are also issues of what politicization when it comes to the distribution of it. That was happening even before COVID. Now, coming to the impact of COVID-19 on debt, you would find that Zimbabwe, like the previous presenter said, it did not benefit from some of the debt initiatives that were being offered. So the state had no option, right? It had to issue some treasury bills and bonds, which led to increase to our debt from around 8 billion, that is in 2019, to about 20.9 billion. And also debt increased so COVID-19 increased the debt, which had a negative effect on economic growth, right? And also the issues, yes, we are celebrating that we have received the special drawing rights, but this is just like 9% of our external debt. And also, yeah, but however, on another side, it's a quarter of our national budget. Because like in terms of US dollars, our budget is around 4 billion, and we are talking about something like a billion. So it's something that if we use, accountably and in a transparent manner, it can help us. Then, as of April 2021, domestic debt has increased by 138%. I know that we have issues here, just because one of the issues that we have to discuss in Zimbabwe is the issue of the information, the way information is available in the public domain. You do find that if we are to go on the website and ask you what is the amount of the debt of Zimbabwe, you will come with your figure, or come with my figure, but we have responsible authorities that are supposed to give us up-to-date information. So it's another area that needs also to be looked at. Then, as we are saying about, these figures do not include the 3.5 billion to compensate white farmers and other opaque resource-based loans. But in the end, they've got a tax burden on what? On citizens. Then, whether we've got COVID or no COVID, penalty and interest will continue to increase. They need to be paid. So as we are doing right now, even if they are saying they are doing their token, even if you pay a token, but the penalties will continue to increase. Then there are also issues of revenue leakages, and I think it's now common to see one of our ministers going around with a begging bowl for more loans. However, due to our high risk again, some will have an argument on that. Are we a high risk country? But according to the international financial institutions, they say we are high risk and we cannot get those funds. So generally, I try to do just a diagram to show you that In 2019, our domestic debt was 8.8, but in 2021, it's now around 20.9. Then the external debt was 8 billion, now it's 10.5. If it wasn't that we have no access to external financing, I can tell you, I can bet, it could be more than 10.5 in terms of external debt. We could have borrowed because we are in dire need of foreign currency or external support. Then on PFM, so revenue streams negatively affected by COVID-19. It reduced tax collection. So when you look at tax, I know there are different taxes. For example, in terms of income tax, right? We are talking of lockdowns, lower demand, and also in terms of CIT, in terms of pay as earn, lower earnings, people begin to earn salaries which were not maybe enough or they were reduced. Then in terms of VAT, just because there was a reduction in consumption, then VAT would decrease. But to my surprise, when you then looked at the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, the 2020 report, actually Zimbabwe performed very well in 2020, which blows my mind to say, how come when you are facing a crisis, our country is performing very well in terms of revenue collection? We then need now to go deeper to then say, who is paying that tax? Is it being paid in a fair manner? Is it progressive or is it regressive? Then that way you can come up with answers. Or is it that they are setting low targets or inflation is assisting them to then say they have surpassed their targets? But they also did another analysis. I will show in my next slide. But also in terms of revenue management and utilization, you would find that just because of lockdowns and what, sometimes at a certain point, deals will be signed without parliamentary scrutiny, right? And also issue of what participation and oversight and transparent accountability were negatively affected by COVID. Then lack of transparency in procurement. We have heard about the Drasgate, nepotism, where a certain lady was employing the whole family. Issues of what the recent August Auditor General's reports, a special report on utilization of COVID-19 funds, which exposed gross embezzlement of funds of over 890 million RTGs, which was being abused. Then also, yeah, of course, there is a proposed PFM amendment bill, which was a positive move in the right direction. But we have to understand that in terms of participation and involvement during the consultations, they were limited just because of what? Lockdown. Maybe if there was no lockdown, we could have done better, and the outcome of that bill would be maybe different with what we are going to have. But we will see as we proceed. So this is what I was explaining. That you'll find from March, okay, next slide, okay, from March to July, actually Zimbabwe was collecting less than what it was collecting in 2019 when we adjusted the figures. When the 2020 inflated adjusted net revenue collections were less than what was being collected in 2019. That for the period. But however, from August going onwards, we realized the collections are now above. So generally, we would say there was increase even in real terms. So these are some of the text. Next slide, sorry. Some of the text components that we say we need to analyze to get to know who was paying those. Are they fair? So you find generally our tax system have more sort of like regressive taxes than progressive taxes. The likes of VAT, IMTT, which normally affect more. If you look at it from a feminist point of view, affect women more than men. Then, in terms of SSD, COVID-19 exacerbated underfunding and exposed dilapidated health and education sector, undermined the right of health and education for men. It magnified inefficiency and inequalities in the delivery of what? Public services. COVID also brought pressure to finance health expenditure. If you look at our budget, I think our budget was around 8 billion for the health sector. And also it will reduce the capacity of the state to respond to and discharge the constitutional social rights. Also, public health facilities face several challenges. And also, in terms of the budget, both the health and the education budget all decreased. Right? then this is what I was saying when I said at one point, for example, in 2019, 72% of of the budget was being financed by donors. Next page. So what are some of the recommendations? So you find one of our major problems is not following our constitution. We have brilliant, maybe, policies in terms of on paper, blueprints. But now come to implementation. That's where the challenge is. So the first thing is just to follow the constitution, right? And what do we do as citizens? Where we see that the government is not following the constitution, where there is lack of political will, what should we do to generate that political will? That's some of the things that we need to discuss as we do this. Then also, we need the prudent debt management. We also need transparent loan contraction, because there are other loans which are being contracted without parliamentary scrutiny, robust programs. I think some of these recommendations were shared by my predecessor. But what I would want us to discuss maybe during the discussion time is to say, what is that we can do that have not been done in the last 20 years or even 40 years? To say, for example, we get our independence in 1980. Now we are now in 2020. What is that we can do differently that we have been doing for the past, say, 40 years? Because where there's no political will, what are we doing to generate that political will? Then also in terms of public finance, the same thing. Because we have got, for example, issues of 60% in terms of the Debt Management Act, 20% in terms of RBZ, all those things are not being followed. But if we do follow them, then we improve in terms of our debt. So then issues of illicit financial flows. Why do we have to say, Minister, month after month they say we have got illicit financial flow, but nothing much is being done to reduce those illicit financial flows? Is it that it's just a theory which cannot be addressed, or is it that there are some people who are benefiting from that enjoy the current status? Then in terms of social delivery, I think we need to prioritize the health sector. Even if we have our debts, let's prioritize the health and education sector. Let's also try to meet the Abuja Declaration, and also who recommended spending of $86 per capita. We also need to upscale education spending, and also issues of what budget execution. It's not fair to hear that the money was not used, yet it had been allocated. What could be the challenge? Maybe as civil society, as citizens, we need to find the problems that is happening within that sector. If it means educating them, capacitating them, let's do that so that that money is used, rather than to say the money was there but it was not used. And even the minister can say, we gave the money but they did not use it, right? So, and also, we also need to have a comprehensive social safety strategy. Mkoma Masimba have said it. It's true that we don't have a database for those people who are in need. So, and also those civil society who assist, each and every organization has its own database. Why can't you have a consolidated so that you avoid the double dipping? That's, and also politicization of that. So we use, maybe if it is about income, if it is about a certain criteria that you've used, we use it fairly, not because you belong to a certain party or you belong to this congregation or something like that. So with that we assist those who are in need. Then also need provision of inclusive and non-partition social assistance. So in short, COVID-19 simply exposed and exacerbated the already existing weakness in our nation. Yet it might have brought, we know that during the same period there was a proposed bill, but did the participation that we saw do a tidal, or in the end it was just because these are people who could manage to walk maybe from one point from point A to point B. If it wasn't COVID, maybe we could have come up with a better thing. Then also we also need to understand that we are operating above the 45 to 57% tax to GDP ratio, which means as long as we have this debt, it will continue to affect our economic growth. Even if we have 4% by end of this year, we could have done much better because the debt is derailing us back. So I'll come back again as we do our discussion to this vote, to then say, what do you see after I've done this presentation, after our discussion? What was the effect of COVID-19 to our health sector? Did it improve or it got worse? And also, I enjoyed the Zimcode, how far position. So I was simply saying our health sector is not good, our education sector is not good. We are sitting on a time bomb and we are busy dragging our debt, and it will impose tax burden on citizens, and also we need to audit the debt to see whether it's legal or not. Once we find the debt which is legal, we find a payment strategy, a payment plan, then we begin to pay. And if it also means to ask for the removal of debt on a humanitarian basis, we can also need to do that. Because we were talking about the 700 billion. How are we going then to ask the cancellation of that? What reasons will we give and on what basis? So with this, I'll submit to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nyamzanga, for such an insightful and well-elaborated presentation. I think I will not attempt to summarize it. Maybe let me call upon Zimcode to give us, in 5 to 7 minutes, their presentation on COVID resource tracker. I've captured some questions which the presenter posed to us. I will highlight those during the discussion. Can I have Muchamidzi to take the floor? Yeah, the IT guys will help you to connect your presentation.
We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muchanya Ramidzi. I work with the Zimbabwe Coalition on Data and Development as the Research and Evidence Officer. Just a rundown of my presentation. I'll give a brief background to the COVID-19 resources tracker in terms of what motivated us as Zimcode to engage on this intervention. Then I'll briefly talk about what it is, the resource tracker. After that, I'll just look briefly in terms of the resource mobilization strategies and sources that were used by the Zimbabwean government to respond to COVID-19. Then some major observations. And lastly, on the key asks, I am sorry, Madam Chair, I wasn't given the time as we were preparing, so I'll just try in a few minutes to run through the few slides that I have. But otherwise, I just want to appreciate the speakers who came before me for the interesting discussions that you invoked in this room. Thank you very much. So in terms of what then motivated us, I'm talking about the COVID-19 resources tracker, which is a tool that we are using as ZimCode to monitor and track COVID-19 earmarked resources. So this is an initiative that we started to do last year in 2020 with the advent of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. So briefly, in terms of what then motivated us as ZimCode to engage on this intervention, it was number one, the urgent need to respond to the virus provoked relaxation of some of the procurement rules and regulations that we operate with as a country. So we saw that was going to prepare ground for sidestepping of the procurement regulations that are supposed to be followed. But it was also because of the nature of the crisis and the need to urgently respond to the crisis, which actually led our government to relax those procurement rules and regulations. So because we saw that there was going to be a gap in terms of procurement, we then thought as ZimCode there is really need for us to try and track how resources are mobilized, how COVID-19 resources are going to be allocated, how COVID-19 resources are going to be expended, especially through procurement. So because the Auditor General has year in, year out been unearthing massive mismanagement, massive abuse, and massive diversion of public resources, which is actually happening through particularly issues of tenderpreneurship, issues of procurement, we then thought maybe we need to do an initiative which is targeted on monitoring and trying to track what is happening. Then the other issue was also that learning from the previous experiences, I'm sure the presenters who came before me were actually touching on those issues to say the abuse of public resources in Zimbabwe is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has been happening, especially in disaster context. So we were trying to draw lessons from Cyclone Idai. We were trying to draw lessons from the 2008 cholera outbreak, because we realized that the government was not coming forth in terms of providing timely feedback and information to the citizens in terms of what is happening with the mobilization of those resources, with the utilization of those resources. So because of that information gap, then that is where we came in to say, in as much as we are in a disaster situation, as much as we are in an emergency situation, but somebody somewhere needs to be monitoring and capturing what is happening with COVID-19 resources. I think the hype around that time was people were trying to focus on how many cases, how many people have tested positive today, and things like that. And of course, the issues around procurement, trying to buy PPEs and other health facilities to respond to the disaster. So it is actually because of those issues around the secrecy, around the management of public resources that is happening in the country, not only for COVID-19 resources, but in general. So in brief, those are some of the issues that actually motivated us as ZimCode to engage on this initiative. So what is that COVID-19 resources tracker? For us, it is just a tool that we are using to monitor, like I said before, COVID-19, to monitor and track COVID-19 earmarked resources. So it is a tool that we have developed to monitor how public resources for COVID-19 are being mobilized, how those public resources are being allocated, and how are they, at the end of the day, being distributed. So we are doing this at a national level. We started in March 2020, like I indicated earlier on, and this is a digital tool that is found on our ZimCode website that we are continuously updating on a weekly basis. And just this week, we have published our 75th issue, which means for the past 75 weeks, we have been trying to monitor how these resources are actually being mobilized, being allocated, and being distributed to the citizens of Zimbabwe. So why did we engage on this initiative? For us, it was two-pronged. We wanted to inculcate a spirit or a culture of transparency from our government. We are trying to push them to publish, especially when we started last year, we were trying to push the government to publish resources that they have received from different development partners. We were trying to push the government to put it clear in black and white the resources that they have set aside as the Zimbabwean government, to say these are the resources that we are putting aside for the COVID-19 response. And we are glad when we started even last year, if you remember very well, I think it was the Sunday mail of 3 May 2020, where we actually saw the government publishing in the Sunday mail the resources that had come in at that time from the various development partners, as well as also clearly outlining the resources that they had put aside for the COVID-19 response. We can go to the next slide. Okay, on this slide, it was just trying to share with you how we are doing this initiative. So for us, it is actually a research-based advocacy approach that we are employing as we are working on this. It is informed by research from different sources. So we are trying to gather information from various sources to feed our resource tracker. If time would have allowed, maybe I would have also just gone through the tracker with you so that you can actually pick what I'm saying. But anyway, it is online, it's digital. You can also visit our website and see it. So for us, really, this approach is based on 3 main elements. The first one being access to information. For us, we believe dissemination of information, timely dissemination of information, is critical to strengthen transparency and accountability, which is a major gap that we are currently faced with in our country. Then the other issue was the issue of accountability, where we are also saying the provision of accurate and complete information regarding the government's allocations and expenditures enable citizens to monitor and track where public spending is, whether it is consistent with the flow of COVID-19 funds or is against the intended objectives. So by this, we are just trying to say that it is an initiative that is trying to inculcate a culture of accountability, which we believe if citizens are being given information, they are actually being equipped or empowered to be in a position to ask those critical questions to the government. But if the citizens are not given information, sometimes they have no basis to lobby, they have no basis to advocate, they have no basis to actually demand accountability from duty bearers. Then lastly, the issue of inclusion and participation. Someone said earlier on that people need to be involved in these processes. People need to be participating we do not encourage prescriptive approaches, but we believe citizens' voices are important in development matters. Citizens' voices need to be put at the center of whatever development initiative that we are working on. So let me just run through. On the next slide, it's speaking to resource mobilization strategies that were used or employed by the government of Zimbabwe to respond to COVID-19. So as you know, our government put in place a raft of measures in order to raise or mobilize resources domestically. So the way they raised the COVID-19, the resources to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, it was two-pronged in terms of mobilizing resources internally, but on the other hand, also mobilizing externally. So internally, that table there is just showing you some of the resources that were actually availed by the government of Zimbabwe to respond to COVID-19. We can go to the next. Okay. Then on this one, we are just talking about external mobilization strategies, where we were saying crowdfunding then was the major boost for our COVID-19 response as a country, where we saw our government engaging with development partners, engaging with various other governments and the private sector for them to actually partner the government in order to strengthen our response. So again, this is just a table to show you some of the resources that came from external sources. These are not all, but it's just some of them. I'm sure you have seen the figures from the previous presenters. So on the next one, we are saying how much resources have we mobilized since 2020? According to our resource tracking, we managed as a country to get commitments or pledges to the tune of 906 million, 0.5, you can see yourself in terms of that figure. So the 906 million is just in pledge form. These are commitments, really, but it's not every commitment that has been made so far. So the other chart on the side is showing you how much has been honored in terms of the pledges that came through and how much has been spent so far to respond to COVID-19. So we 673 so far million has been honored, and we have used about 603 million. Then on the next one, it is showing you that from the 673 million that we are saying has been honored by those that have made the pledges, about 60%, 65% of those pledges were coming from external. Like I told you that our approach was two-pronged as a country, external and then internal mobilization. So about 35% of the resources that we got were coming from here, while the 65 was coming from outside. Then again, on those honored pledges, I just wanted to make it clear that about 30% were non-monetary. So from the way we have been monitoring these resources and tracking them, what we have been doing is that you will remember that some of the support was coming to us in monetary form, while some of the stuff was actually coming either in humanitarian form, or maybe it was infrastructural support, or whether it was PPE, etc. So this is just a breakdown to show you how we arrived at those figures. Okay. So on the observations and gaps, these are the observations that we have been making as we were tracking resources. Some of the issues I'm happy that they've already been spoken to by the previous speakers. No violation of the constitutional and legal provisions. I mean, I may not need to elaborate further on that, but we will all agree that our PFM systems as a country are very, very porous. We continue to see resources leaving us. We continue to see looting. We continue to see embezzlement. There are various cases that have actually been referred to earlier. We all know about the drugs gate. We all know about Portia Manangazira's case, etc. So we are also saying, with all these resources, because for me the major issue was with all these resources, we should have been seeing something that is translating either to human development, something that was going to be translating into something that is tangible in the social and economic aspects of the citizens' lives. So we are saying instead of easing COVID-19 burden on the citizens, in fact, the citizens' plight actually deepened. Why? Because of public officials who we have entrusted with the responsibility of safeguarding those resources, but they are actually diverting those resources to their own benefit. So the cost of such resource abuse, the previous speaker has already talked about it, the collapsing service delivery, crumbling education sector, the health sector is actually on its knees. Then the issues around the social, the weak social protection framework that we have as a country. I'm almost done. Don't worry, I'm concluding. Okay, then still on the gaps and the observations that we have been making, there is the issue of lack of transparency around COVID-19 vaccine procurement, and we are really calling forth on the government to make it transparent in terms of how these procurements are actually happening. Because right now we know, as the Minister of Finance has actually indicated, that about 127.3 million has been spent on buying about 12.5 million doses and about 15 million syringes for the vaccine program. But then what remains unclear is the breakdown or the disaggregated information, the granular information to really say we have used this much on what exactly, because even this 12.5 million doses is actually a figure which is also including the donations that we have received as a country. So you can actually see that there is really lack of clarity. We cannot say 127.3 million has been spent on 12.5, but the 12.5 is also including the donations that were coming. Then, of course, the issue that as a country we are further plunging into debt, I think it has been spoken to. Then another key issue there that we also see is the COVID-19 financing and the natural resource conundrum. And for this one, we are really saying that the issue of donations, the issue of vaccine donations from countries such as China, countries such as Russia, for us, we see that it has actually stirred debate and panic among citizens. It is really not so clear what the government stance is or where they intend to go. Then the issue of the donation trap diplomacy, for us, we also see that as very, very problematic in terms of robust procurement. Why? Because we see that we have been getting a lot of donations from China, we've been getting donations from Russia, and apparently it is again from those countries where we are buying vaccines. So we are saying, is it some hidden debt trap or something? We are not so sure, and there is no information again to make this clear to us. Okay, so I was just saying the whole PFM system really needs a wholesome reform. So as I conclude, our key asks from the monitoring and tracking of resources that we have been having are, number one, the issue that we really need to conduct a comprehensive COVID-19 resource audit. We know and we are aware that the special COVID-19 audit report was released, but there are issues around the timing again of that report, and there are issues again around the comprehensiveness of that report, because as you know, the report only covered about 6 provinces, leaving out Harare, leaving out Bulawayo, which are the major cities, especially Harare being the hub of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, which was mainly responsible for housing these COVID-19 resources. So we are saying, as our key ask, we really need to conduct a comprehensive COVID-19 resource audit that is also incorporating issues around the donations that we have received, because the report that is there actually is just covering the resources that have been mobilized internally, going to the various ministries, but it also excluded the donations that were coming from development partners. Then secondly is the issue around building strong institutions. We are saying we really need to strengthen our institutions. The public sector in general really needs to be up on its feet in terms of upholding transparency and accountability as it is enshrined in Section 298 of our Constitution. Then we also see parliamentary oversight, very, very key in terms of providing the necessary oversight and scrutiny on COVID-19 resource spending. So we really think that the Parliament really needs strengthening for it to be able to perform their key mandate. Then we are also saying increased transparency in COVID-19 debt contraction. I may not elaborate on this because I know it has also been discussed before. Then we are also asking the government to reorganize our social protection mechanisms in Zimbabwe so that they meaningfully cushion the marginalized, they meaningfully cushion the vulnerable groups of our communities. Then the issue of constitutionalism, I'm happy that the previous speaker also talked about it, and we are saying, let's just go back to constitutionalism. Let's return to constitutionalism. Let's uphold our constitution and all the legal provisions that are there. Then lastly, political will to plug corruption and illicit financial flows. So we are saying the executive really needs to show and act in terms of this political will to really plug out corruption. Again, that issue has been said before. So allow me to end by this quote from Rigobert Menchu, which says, without strong watchdog institutions, immunity becomes the very foundation upon which systems of corruption are built. If impunity is not demolished, all efforts to bring an end to corruption are in vain. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Muchade, for sharing with us your initiative as SIMCOD to monitor and track COVID resources. I've got a question to you, but you answer it during the discussion session. To say that, at what stage do you monitor the use of resources? Is it at the hospital level, or you just monitor when these resources are being announced at the higher level, at the national level? Because the one question that I have is, for example, we hear that we have received more than 12 million vaccines, for example, but the uptake is at less than 3 million. Is it the issue of access, or maybe there's more to it? Is your tracker able to answer such questions? May I at this stage invite Honorable Molokele to come to the platform. Muchamidzi as well as Dr. Sinyama. Madam Virginia Makanza, you can also come forward to share your insights just in 5 minutes, following what has been discussed. What, in your view, do you think about COVID-19 impact and public debt management in Zimbabwe? Mucha, just take the stage for the sake of responding to the questions. So can I start with you, Madam Virginia? Share your thoughts with us. Just in 5 minutes.
They've been raised in the previous presentations. Right, as the facilitator was saying, the uptake of vaccines is very low. To date, we have 128,464 cases as the 21st of September, 128,464 cases of COVID, 4,596 deaths. First dose vaccines, 2,976,512, and second dose, 2,106,898. Right, what are the implications of that? And in terms of debt, I just want to reiterate the point that debt is necessary for the developing and developed countries, but it depends on what you are using it for. Is it for productive? Is it for productive purposes, or is it for consumptive purposes? And the effects of that will be different, right? And it has also been raised that Zimbabwe's debt has been rising, and at the moment we are relying on domestic resource mobilization, right? And then the issue that I want to raise under public finance management is that we seem not to have the right public institutions. And when we do not have institutions that can effectively manage resources, there's the problem of power politics then interfering, and that affects long-term development. And government needs to manage resources, and it needs to be accountable to citizens, right? At the present moment, our debt management, we see issues or cases of irresponsible borrowing. There's no transparency and accountability. There's also weak parliamentary oversight, and the prioritization of the funds is also poor, right? Then getting to the impact of COVID, right? COVID put pressure on strained public resources, resulting in compromised service delivery. And we see that the service delivery in health, education, and social protection was severely affected. And there's a chance that this will reverse the gains that we've made so far in the living standards. And if we look at the sectors that are affected, they've got a bearing on the reproductive role of women, so the burden will come back to women. We see that schools were closed in response to the lockdown measures, but then access to remote learning was limited, especially for poor households and also in rural areas. According to the Zimstat Rapid Prices Phone Survey, which was carried out in July 2020, only 30% of the children in rural areas were reported to having access to remote learning, compared to 70% in urban areas. And we know that now schools have reopened and the exam classes are supposed to be writing their exams. So what are the implications of that? And again, the number of poor went up because livelihoods were disrupted. Most people lost their jobs. Most people in the informal sector, they could not operate because of the lockdown measures. But then the social protection coverage was not there. And we know that there are some people who were asked to open or to register lines, phone lines, net one lines, so that they would get their social safety payments. But most people did not get them. They just have the lines, but nothing happened. And then in the health sector, when lockdown started, we were also faced with strikes. Doctors were on strike, and because of the lockdown, there were reduced hours for nurses. And also inadequate quantities of PPE, and also slow access to that. They were not able to get the PPE on time. So that means there was a decline in the coverage and quantity of essential services. And this point is, I think this one was raised, that the pandemic showed or revealed our state of unpreparedness. We were very unprepared. Our health system could not cope. There were inadequate safety nets. There was no capacity to deal with the economic shocks. And also we showed lack of capacity to manage the resources that were at our disposal. And then in terms of funds management, Mucha just talked about the normal procedures that were not followed. There were hurried decisions that were taken which compromised transparency and accountability, and also it led to illicit financial flows. The Auditor General's special report on financial management on the utilization of public resources in combating COVID-19 uncovered abuse and misappropriation of over 890 million. Right, and I've already talked about Parliament not exercising its scrutiny and oversight role because of the lockdown. Then in terms of economic growth, the pandemic slowed down economic growth. And in 2020, our GDP is estimated to have contracted by 8% for the second year in a row because of the restrictions that were there, right? And the response from government was only in fiscal and monetary policies. It was limited to containing the volatile prices, right? In terms of recommendations, right?
I think we've heard enough from, in the interest of time. We still have another session coming.
Okay, I just
Thank you very
wanted
much for
to
those submissions.
recommendations.
You will post them to me to include in the report. Because we only have about 10 minutes before we wind up. Now over to you, Honorable Molokele. There are some questions that were highlighted by the presenter to the effect that what is it that we can do? We've heard the problems that we're discussing for over 40 years. Where are we missing it? What does it require for us to adhere to the public debt management legal framework, among other issues that you raised? Just 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm a bit sidetracked because I prepared some notes. but this is more of a direct question. Okay. Okay, I think I'll try to premise my response in a particular way. As a legislator or as a parliamentarian, my role is sort of divided into three main pillars. One, I'm a representative. Two, I'm a lawmaker. Three, I'm a watchdog. So in that context, as a representative, I think it's important that we amplify the voices that talk about debt and development in this country with clarity and with confidence, and also based on researched facts. At this moment in time, I don't see that in the public domain, where we've got strong voices, people who are able to influence the national discourse, and they speak with authority on this subject matter. So we need to increase the number of public opinion makers who are also subject matter experts on debt and development. And that way, it will allow us as a country to have some particular focus on this issue with a sense of resolution. I know that it's very difficult to stay a national debate. There are many other conflicting interests. But this is one particular area that I feel we need to up our game and force the country, force the nation to start talking about debt and development, especially in the context of public finance management. As a legislator or as a lawmaker, I think it's very important to take a second look at the kind of legislative framework that is there in the country at the moment. How progressive is it? How enabling is it? How is it able to enhance our ability to manage our resources in a very accountable and transparent way? So let's look at the laws themselves. Let's look at the parliamentary capacity to change those laws, to amend those laws. So especially civil society, ZimCode and others, there is need to work closely with us, with other organizations in this space, people like Veritas, to see how we can actually review the legislature and say which are the laws that need to be changed and how can they be changed. And then technically capacity build lawmakers like me to push for changes and amendments so that they enhance the legislative framework. And also to make sure that there is policy that speaks directly to the interest of addressing this issue. And the policy framework as it stands today, I don't see any form of clarity. I'm one of the outsiders. So I would need a lot of capacity building, and I'm sure the majority of the legislators will be very keen to see how they can help to influence the policy framework apart from the legislative framework. Lastly, as a watchman or as a watchdog, or playing my oversight role as a parliamentarian, I think that's another very important role that we could play because, for example, just by mentioning the Auditor General's report on the COVID response, if you could take a second look at the members of parliament today and say, have you seen the report? What are the key issues that you are picking from the report? What are the key action points that you are taking forward? That kind of analysis is lacking already. And I think there is need for capacity build in building, even for the legislators, to make sure that they are able to play their role without being emotional, but rationalizing the issues. And in that context, it's good that the Parliament of Zimbabwe, at least at this particular parliament, is it the 8th parliament or the 9th parliament? I'm getting mixed up. 8th parliament, right? No, I'm sure. Is it the 8th parliament? 9th. Yeah, because with the recall thing that we're having, some of us are getting mixed up. But anyway, it's the 9th parliament. So I think our role as an oversight body has been severely compromised. There's been a lot of changes in terms of the original group that was elected. There's been a lot of upheaval and uncertainty and doubt. But still, Parliament has inbuilt institutions that are partners in this particular space. ZimCode and others who are subject matter experts can work with us. And I mentioned it earlier on, that to make us more effective when it comes to playing our role as watchdogs, we have facilities. One of the obvious ones is a parliamentary caucus on debt and development, which will then ensure that you don't deal with parliamentarians as an homogeneous group or as an omnibus group, what you could call in Zimbabwe language, ZUPCO. You would want to particularize the MPs that are particularly interested in this area and capacity build them so that they push the oversight role through a caucus. So that's one thing that you could do and make sure that we are more effective. I can see you are freaking out in terms of time.
My apologies.
Okay, thank you so much.
We are running out of time, but thank you very much for the submissions. Now over to you, Dr. Nyam.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. My observations are quite very clear. Some of the issues are indeed, said earlier on. But let me highlight that from the COVID-19 perspective, I think there is no doubt in our minds that it has bequeathed a deep and lasting, long-lasting impact on our economy in terms of service delivery, whichever angle you want to take it, depending on your background. But as we discuss, let's also, I think, even, sometimes commend the government for a sterling job. Because, if you compare Zimbabwe with other African nations, I think we have managed the COVID issues very well. There are the major issues that I observed myself. They are to do with the public finance management, especially the good governance dimension, where you look at now, it could be transparency, it could be accountability, it could be integrity issues. But generally, even, issues to do with the prioritization, I understand. But let's not take the armchair approach to this whole thing. Remember, we are saying this is a pandemic one which is also an emergency. So even when we try to factor in the preparedness concept, but let's say robbers come here and they point their guns at us, how do you react? Obviously, the way you react will also reflect unpreparedness. So even as a nation, not only the government, the citizens themselves. So what it exactly means is that as we work together, issues to do with the trust, confidence, those are very important in whatever we want to do. It could be a program, it could be a policy, in whatever form. So as we are gathered here today, one of the key issues with our parliamentarians, the trust as a representative in your communities. You have the citizens, you have the people rally behind you, explain the issues to us. We get to understand. The more we understand them, the more we rally behind and the more we support you. Even issues to do with corruption, accountability. If we are enlightened, we have the insights, we have the knowledge, we cooperate even in terms of dealing with, with those issues. So then at the end of the day, we'll be in a position to achieve whatever we want to achieve. So without taking much of your time, Madam, I think I'm done.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doc, for those submissions. I will have one round of questions. May I see by the raising of hand, possibly 5 burning questions? Okay. Yes, Madam.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to reiterate, first of all, that in as much as we're continuously talking about health and education, we also need to put into consideration the issue of food security. Because if you look at the USAID report, it shows that in 2019, 5.5 million Zimbabweans were food insecure. But if you look at the World Food Programme report of 2020, already 7.7 million had gone under food insecurity. So that means the COVID-19 situation has exacerbated the need for social service delivery systems to be, upped so that we have social security nets. But that was a comment. Going into my questions, I have two questions, and they are built on the presentation that Mr. Lenmo Mudzonga had made. So if we look at his presentation, he was talking about how in 2019, the domestic debt was 8.8, and 2021 showing, if I got it correctly, 20.9. So my question now to the lawmakers, to the legislators, I would have loved to pose this question to the Ministry of Finance, but seeing that, I don't know, I'm not so sure if they've got representation here. So how then is the guiding policy document NDS1 addressing the issue of debt, particularly when we're looking at are there mechanisms that deal directly with the state of debt, be it internal debt and external debt? That is my first question. Mine goes to the issue of, he talked about ZIMRA, and looking at the ZIMRA report shows that when we're looking at our tax justice, that report shows that Zimbabwe, let me say ZIMRA, was able to put together an amount of 171.9 billion, but you find that 111.55, which is approximately 64.89% of that amount, was lost to tax expenses. So my question is to say, do we, as Zimbabwe, have a tax incentive monitoring and evaluation mechanism in place so that we curb those losses? Because at the end of the day, these are the illicit financial flows that we're talking to. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we submit our questions just in 30 seconds or so?
Yeah, thank you so much. Mine will be, thanks so much, Mucha, for an excellent presentation. But I worry, because we now seem to have a new phenomenon. With the COVID response, particularly with the resources that we received as a country, we now have a new mantra in this nation, which is the arrest and release mantra. We also saw what happened to our previous Minister of Health, Dr. Obadiah Moyo, with, after all the provision of all the evidence that was labeled against him, he actually was just released. And then we really wonder, to what extent are we as a country serious about this particular? Because you actually highlighted the issue about parliamentary oversight. I think there is really so much need for them to be strengthened. Because right now, there are lots of things that we really know. You gave an example, Mucha, about Cyclone Idai. We actually discovered, we actually went there with the Japanese embassy. We actually saw 9 donations of generators. And when we went there, we only discussed now and others were stolen. And by who? Our own top government officials. And we can't remain quiet, because one of it was meant for the health sector. And we really wonder, to what extent are we able to make sure that we put these vagabonds in power in prison? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another hand.
Thank you very much. Directed to Mr. Len Moore, and I will remove the background in the interest of time. Your presentation was silent on statutory instruments and the impact that they've had on democratic accountability to do with a lot of other governance issues, but in our context, public finance management. How much of a disruptive effect, if any, do you think the SIs have had on accountability and transparency? And then thank you to Mucha for the very precise presentation, but just as a general comment, my experience with research with government institutions is that they are very notorious when it comes to accessing information. What has been your experience with that? And just as a recommendation, I think we've been found wanting in terms of e-governance. I think we can do much better, which would certainly aid to transparency and accountability.
Okay. I will leave two last people who want to contribute here. I don't have their names here.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you. So my first question, I don't know who to direct it to, but I just hope it will be answered. I wanted to ask on the issue of social services sector. Why do we borrow money for social services, yet we don't deliver what we have borrowed the money for? And is it what we have said, the issue of database, of like the number of people who really need the assistance, or it's a way of, just having the money and enjoying the money, yet other people who are really in need of the money are suffering? And the other question, I had I don't know, but the previous speaker, he spoke about unpreparedness not being the issue of the government only. I think it's the issue of the government and, partly maybe the citizens. Because, for example, COVID-19 came and we have people with disabilities. And most people with disabilities are in the informal sector. We are living from hand to mouth, especially women with disabilities. And then COVID-19 came. The government did not even provide the COVID funds for those women with disabilities or even persons with disabilities. And yet you say we, as citizens, should be prepared. How do we prepare, yet we are living from hand to mouth? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, participants. Now I hand over the mic to the panelists to respond to what has been raised in the...
Yeah, thank you very much for all the questions. I'll begin with my brother in reference to structural instrument. Actually, Zimbabwe, we are on record of producing a lot of statutory instruments. So I'm not sure which specific statutory instrument you are referring to, but I will speak of maybe the 127 about issue of foreign currency, where I think it sort of exposed the consumers, where it's more like a fight between the business people and the government. But in the end, who is suffering? The consumers. You understand, when they introduced that such an instrument, the prices in terms of foreign currency, they increase and they never fall. So in the end, what is happening? Goods are now expensive both in US dollar and in RTGS. So such type of statutory instrument, they may have good intentions. That is between the government and the business people, but you have a detrimental effect on the consumers. They are not on the table. And if you are not on the table, you are the menu. Then on social safety nets, maybe I have to clarify that I didn't say that we have to borrow for social safety nets per se. But I'm saying, due to COVID-19, we have realized that funds are now being diverted from maybe being used for social safety nets, maybe to repay debts. Then you are saying, in the event that there are funds that are directed to the social safety nets, we have a challenge that there is no specific database to then say, maybe if your resources are limited, if you assist the A and B, next time we should assist C and D and avoid re-assisting again A and B. So this is the call that we are calling for, maybe from the responsible ministry. If it is there, let us know where we can find it and how we can improve it. And let's try to avoid the issue of politicization and so forth. Then I also wanted to point on the issue of tax expenditure that was raised by my sister. Yeah, it's quite a challenge. We would expect in future maybe Zimbabwe and the Ministry of Finance to improve, not only to tell us the tax expenditure, but also to tell us the potential benefit or the benefit that we benefited from issuing those tax expenditure, so that we can then evaluate. They had promised that us maybe in 2019 that they are going to come up with an evaluation method, but we haven't seen it. If it is there, may you kindly provide it to the public so that we can assess, because it is our duty as citizens to make follow-ups and see if things are being done according to book. And when I say the book, I'm referring to the Constitution of Zimbabwe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think most of the issues that were raised were actually comments and not questions as such. I want to speak to the issue that Doctor spoke about, the need to applaud the government in terms of what they are doing well. I think maybe if we missed in our presentations, we really want to applaud them for what they have done well. I think on the vaccination program, we are doing well, and this has been recognized regionally and internationally, and we want to commend the government for that. But at the same time, there are also, I think you will agree, that there are serious and critical issues that we are found wanting as a country and that we really need to address. For instance, we do have very progressive laws. We do have very progressive even blueprints as a country, but where we are lacking the most is implementation. So once we try and implement what we have on paper, I think we will be heading towards some good direction. So ours really remain a call for transparency and accountability, particularly in the manner in which public resources are managed, not only COVID-19, but public resources in general. So there was also Dr. David Makwerere raised an issue that, yes, the government, and I want to agree with you, they are very, very notorious and evasive when it comes to providing information, especially of this nature, because that's when you hear them talking about, be it the trade secrets, etc. But so we have also been encountering those challenges, the red tapes and bureaucracies in government. We have been faced with that, but to try and answer you how we have been trying to counter that challenge is that as ZimCode, we were actually seconded in the pillar number 8 task force, COVID-19 task force, which deals with issues around supply and procurement of COVID-19 essentials. So that is basically where we have been able to get most of the information. But again, the information still comes, it's not disaggregated, it's not whatever. So we still remain with some gaps here and there, which is why, Evangelista, on your question that you raised earlier on, that is your tracker able to answer all these questions? And I will say to you, no. And that is the reason why some of these issues, we also present them as questions, because we are continuously questioning how far with this, how far with that, how far with this. We are pushing for prosecution, for instance, around the issues of the misuse and abuses that we have been talking about, where the Minister of Health and others have been implicated in gross mismanagement of public funds. Then the other issue, I think it was around, the social protection systems. So I just want to say, as a coalition which represents people, we really feel we shortchanged as citizens of Zimbabwe, as public officials continue to divert public resources that are meant to actually ameliorate the negative impacts that have been brought about by COVID-19 for their own benefit. So as a result, you see there is growing skepticism, there is growing public mistrust around the manner in which public resources are managed. So it then becomes very difficult for us on one hand to continue to applaud the government when we are having this growing mistrust, because the government is failing or has been abrogating its duty. It has failed to deliver on the social contract that it has with us as citizens. So I just want to conclude by saying, Honorable Molokele, I want to agree with what you have been saying, that we really need to amplify the voices of the people that matter, people of influence that can really stand and speak about these debt and development issues. And I want to support what you've been saying, that as civil society and other organizations, we really need to partner and capacitate the parliament, capacitate them so that they are able to deliver on their mandate, which primarily is to defend and protect the constitution and to represent the people, because we understand we cannot all go into the parliament, but we have you, so represent us and ensure that we do not end up again trapped in this resource-based vaccines phenomenon that is actually coming. So I thank you, Evangelist.
Thank you very much for those submissions. I don't know whether there's any burning issue which Honorable Molokele you would want to raise, or Dr. Sinyama? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your contributions. This brings us to the end of session 2. We are now breaking for tea break, 5 minutes tea break. So we just go and grab our teas. We work over tea. Thank you so much.
We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Increased risky borrowing by African countries. Aid crisis, increasing poverty, inequality. Our governments borrow and we pay without involving us. Vana vamasiya, agogo kalamba, anyamada kusawan chito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, unsustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. Vana vamasiya, agogo kalamba, anyamada kusawan chito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Increased risky borrowing by African countries. Aid crisis, increasing poverty, inequality. Our governments borrow and we pay without involving us. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawa nchito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, unsustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. Vana vamasiya agogo kalamba anyamada kusawa nchito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. We are the champion. 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 We are the champions. call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion, 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 we are the champions. Lack of transparency, accountability, unsustainable loans. Street children, increasing crime and survival for the fittest. Increased burden on women, girls, and people with disability. Vana mama siya, agogo kalamba, anyamada gusawan chito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion, 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 we are the champions. We call governments to commit to an economic system that shares value more equally, that is sustainable for the future of humanity and the planet, and that serves the people. We are the champion, 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 we are the champions. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion, 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 we are the champions. Increased risky borrowing by African countries. A debt crisis, increasing poverty, inequality. Our governments borrow and we pay without involving us. Vana mama siya, agogo kalamba, anyamada gusawan chito. We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. You and I are the people to hold our governments to account. We are the champion, 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 we are the champions. Lack of transparency.
anything because the election is this weekend. So it's like the country's just kind of comatose until this
delivered by Dr. Lauren Johnston. I should note that this presentation is an excerpt from an Afrodat study that we commissioned that looks at Chinese investments, transparency and debt sustainability in Africa. This study looks at 5 countries, namely Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia, DRC, and Angola. And these are countries that are having problematic issues with engagements with Chinese investments within the continent. So be that as it may, I think time might be not within our control. I kindly call upon Lauren Johnston to take the floor, but before she does as well, I would like to call upon our panelists to also sit in. So for this session, we do have 2 online or virtual panelists, namely Patrick Anam from Development Reimagined. He is a trade, law, and policy expert focusing on China-Africa relations or China-Africa investments. And then we do have Professor Deborah Brottigam, who is the director of the China-Africa Research Initiative based within the Johns Hopkins University in the United States of America. For our in-house panelists, I would like to call upon Dr. Rafael Sila from the Midland State University. He's a researcher and expert on development in Zimbabwe. So Dr. Sila, if you can just take a seat. And then I would also call upon our senior policy analyst on debt, Tirangani Mtazu, to also take to the floor as well, as he will be part of our panelists as well. Honorable Edmund Mkaratigwa is within the house, but I'm not so sure at the moment if he will be a panelist pending some issues, but be that as it may. Lauren, I give you the floor to deliver your presentation. Thank you.
Then you can kind of flavor the bigger picture and hopefully also take people out of this kind of very micro debt disaster distributional issue. Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here. Dennis has left the podium. Are you looking at the gallery view?
Yeah, I have it on my screen.
Yeah. Okay, unmuted. I'm muting.
Hello, can you hear me? Can I be heard?
Hi, Lauren. Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I didn't hear that introduction, I'm sorry. So I will be talking separate from that. Hello, my name is Dr. Lauren Johnston, and I'm Australian, and I hold a PhD in economics from Peking University on China-Africa economic ties. And I have previously worked in Sierra Leone, but actually as an Australian, I understand China complexity probably more than many. So slightly different to the title in the agenda today, I'm going to kind of step back, since this is a more international panel, and have a look at kind of, how did we get to where we are in terms of Chinese investments, and how can it be differently approached in order to kind of dig Zimbabwe out of a debt hole, if that's what it is in. So just to go to the next slide. So I just want to add a kind of caveat to this story, which many of the speakers today have already noted. There is really inadequate data and transparency in order to even properly assess what is going on in terms of China, Zimbabwe debt sustainability, and what is the impact. So for all we know, there's many positive impacts, but even they can't be assessed because there's not sufficient data. And then, not obviously the economic ties are intensive in a historical sense and contemporarily. However, it's a unique story. So, there's a bit more information, a lot more research done on China, Africa. And I'll focus a bit on that because that's where we have more kind of understanding. And then hopefully with your knowledge of Zimbabwe, you can all work out how that best applies to the Zimbabwe case and what lessons you can draw from that for really the much more micro details of the Zimbabwe case, which some of you will have the knowledge of in terms of the data and so on. I don't. And so just a quick presentation structure, kind of a stepping out of this very detailed, granular issue of all the debt dynamics and the distributional issues around COVID to a kind of a bigger picture of China, Africa, China, Zimbabwe. And then the second part, which is like development finance with Chinese characteristics, a kind of a very basic introduction to that. And then merging those two, like, you know, how could things go forward differently in a way that helps Zimbabwe to try to meet all those needs of all of its people at the same time as growing. So, for example, that the growth rate exceeds the rate of growth of debt and so on. So really like stepping back, like to the very big picture, how did we get where we are? Why is China suddenly interested to lend a heap of money to Africa where it maybe wasn't even a decade ago? Why, you know, everyone thinks it's Xi Jinping and Belt and Road, but actually look at this slide. And this is a really long run kind of demographics picture. And the red line is China, which basically its working age population share peaked a decade ago. And so now every year there's fewer and fewer workers and there's more and more old people. So, you know, China used to be a country full of very kind of low wage, poor workers. It's not anymore. It's increasingly full of retirees and it has fewer workers, but they're a bit more educated. And then the green line, you can see the world. So the world's population itself is kind of flatlining, so to speak. But then on the bottom, you have this Africa line. So Africa's got the highest rate of population growth in the world. And so it's kind of the opposite of China, where China is getting rich. In fact, I'll go to the next slide. So this is a slide that shows the density of children in any country. So the really pale countries have a low population share of children. So most of the pale countries are on a population decline trajectory unless they have lots of immigration. And the darkest colored countries are basically very, very rich in children. They have, you know, 40% or more of their population, or over 30 or more, or 40 or more of children. So you can really see kind of Central and West Africa is super rich in children. But that also means this is the part of the world that most needs to focus on education and ultimately job creation. Whereas China is looking to invest in those children and those future jobs. So the way to kind of see Africa, if you're looking from a Chinese lens, you know, in 1980, China was full of children, just like these Central African countries today. It's not anymore. Now it's full of more educated people. It needs to pay pensioners. It needs to find new sources of growth. And so they see those children as kind of future sources of growth, just like they saw their own. And so then this next slide is the same story, but it kind of separates some of the yellow countries are the ones that really need growth. So the blue countries are rich and old, so they're already developed, which doesn't mean they don't need growth. They also need growth to pay all their pensioners. The yellow countries are still trying to get rich, even though they're already quite old. The red countries are rich and young. They're very few. They tend to have oil. And so all the green countries, so if you think about this Belt and Road project of China, the Maritime Silk Road, which is the Indian Ocean one, is really an agenda to try and tap into all those green markets, all that future growth. And so, you know, China only became yellow like 10 or so years ago, maybe 15 years ago. So at that point, that roughly coincided with the financial crisis. And so they're looking like, where is the next growth? Where is the next 40 years of growth? If the story can be turned into a growth story, the next equivalent are those green countries. So just to kind of look like the Maritime Silk Road and the Belt and Road overall, but that is really the red line. And you can see how it taps into those kind of green, poor and young countries with this theoretical idea that they can be that same demographic worker-driven growth frontier that East Asia was for the last 50 years. So it's kind of like shifting from East Asia to the Indian Ocean, especially to Africa. So this is the kind of very like step back roads all of a sudden. Why do they want to build ports and bridges? And number two, they're like trying to foster that next wave. They see you as themselves in 1980, not quite 1980 in a demographic sense, but the potential at least. So then always like, it's very easy to just see the Belt and Road as this roads and debt, or bridges and debt. When Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, he did it with 2 speeches. The second one he's done to me is the most interesting because it has like 5 policies. See them here: strengthen policy communication, strengthen road, promote unimpeded trade. So that's partly you build the infrastructure in order to promote unimpeded trade, but also unimpeded trade using digital technology, which can enable much more trade than previously, but only, of course, if you have the digital infrastructure and the roads and ports and so on. And then maybe kind of less important to hear, like strengthening currency circulation and, so volumes of trade and different currencies and people-to-people ties. Obviously, Zimbabwe is very rich in the last one already, and possibly the first one, but maybe you can develop those other 3 points. So what win guts of what the Belt and Road is? It's not just about throwing around money to build roads. It's trying to build the next frontier of growth in, China sees as being able to help foster its own growth and their growth at the same time. And also it didn't come out of nowhere. You can see these 2 lines. This is Chinese outbound foreign direct investment, inbound outbound. Like the outbound is slightly volatile, but you can see basically that about 10 years ago, outbound investment exceeded inbound investment. So the Belt and Road was launched 1 year before this long trajectory, when in any case it could be foreseen that China's outbound investment was about to exceed inbound investment. Like it's really just a kind of a very bizarre Chinese name.